Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey guys, back again with the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute, answering all of your questions in rapid fire succession to the best of my ability. So got a great email here. It's a little bit longer, but I'm going to read all the way through it. And there's a really great question here, or great set of questions in here. So this is from Paul, who says, "Hey Alan, really enjoy all the content you put out YouTube and via podcast. I started home distilling about 8 years ago on a stovetop in a small apartment in a big city. But over the last 2 years or so, I've moved to a new place where I have more space to get much more serious about the hobby. And as much as it's a ton of work, I have been loving every second of it. I have mostly been doing brandies and all-grain whiskeys with ingredients straight from farms nearby, which has been a privilege and a source of great satisfaction to me. I notice you do consultations on your website, and I'm putting together a bit of a list of questions as they come up to take you up on one of those in the near future. But I noticed something on your recent video where you reviewed the Bad Motivator barrel, and it's been eating at me, so I thought I'd ask. You mentioned the barrel you filled with agave spirit was toasted but uncharred. It seems like the convention these days is to have at least some char, even if it's off of a used bourbon barrel, and that a char is critical to introduce a layer of activated carbon to absorb some off flavors. I'm wondering what characteristics of a spirit, and maybe what kind of spirits, would lend themselves well to uncharred oak and what someone could expect from an aged product. Are there any spirits that primarily use uncharred oak for aging? And since you're a history buff, is there a history of uncharred oak anywhere in the distilling world? Cheers, and thanks again for all the great content. I will always have a lot to learn, but your insight has really helped propel me from moonshiner to distiller." That's awesome. I really appreciate that greatly. So these are fantastic questions. So we went with toasted on that particular barrel because the spirit that I was putting in it, the agave spirit I put in it, was double pot distilled, and it was cut very, very clean. In other words, no real heads, no real tails. Without those heads and tails in there, I don't need that char level, basically, to pull anything out of the particular spirit. And so this is kind of the thing that I think sometimes people get confused on. So the char is not there for flavor, right? The char is there, as you mentioned, as a filtration device. So heavier bodied spirits, things have more grunginess, more funkiness in them. And for example, with bourbons, you want a little heads and a little tails to go into the barrel because they esterify and become positive flavors in the long run over long-term maturation in a normal size 53-gallon barrel or in these Bad Motivator barrels. You may want that 3 or 4 char to actually take up some of the acetaldehyde and ethyl acetate that come across in that particular distillation. You'll see heavy chars in Kentucky specifically because they're using low rectification column stills, which don't really make cuts. There's no real heads cut. There's no real hearts cut. There's no real tails cut. The only thing they can do is run their condenser a little bit hotter to get rid of some of the volatile heads. But they always have some of that left, and therefore they need that 3 or 4 char to absorb that and take some of those off flavors out of the product. Even with double pot distilled, well-made bourbons, you definitely want to have that char level, in my opinion, at least a 1 or 2 char, maybe even a 3. It's stylistically up to you. But the toast is really where the flavor comes in when it comes to oak. So the toast is where you're actually caramelizing those sugars and setting those sugars into action and able to get that flavor to come into the product that you want, that flavor that you're so familiar with from oak, whether it be the caramels or the vanillins or the baking spices or those sorts of things. A toasted uncharred barrel is not going to be as heavy on the vanillins, for example, and it's not going to be as heavy on the caramels, right? Because you've not caramelized that sugar from the toast level. It's going to be a much more smooth, sort of like butterscotch transition, maybe a little bit buttery, that sort of thing as well. It's not nearly as aggressive on the spirit as what a charred barrel is going to be. And so therefore, for clean spirits or spirits that don't need a ton of maturation, you don't want that char in there because you're going to overrun all the flavors, especially when you're dealing with something delicate like, say, agave syrup, where agave syrup does not have inherently that roasty, smoky flavor of its own accord, and you have to build it into the fermentation and the distillation. Even then, it's still very volatile, and so we don't want to overrun that with that heavy charred oak. As far as the history of toasted oak barrels, there's a long, long history of toasted oak barrels. So toasted oak barrels actually predate charred barrels quite a bit. If you go back and you look at kind of traditional bourbon lore, and we don't know how much of this is entirely true where the charred barrel came from, etc. But they were certainly understanding of the fact that in Cognac, France, toasted barrels were being used for cognac, and they are still used for cognac to this day because, again, it's much more of a light, cleaner, elegant, more volatile style spirit that char would just overrun unless you make a very specific bourbon style brandy, which you can do. But there's definitely a place for those charred or those toasted barrels over the charred. I think agave spirits fit that well. Obviously, certain brandies, whether it be apple brandy or it be grape brandy, depending on their distillation style and their fermentation style, because there is a difference between what happens here in the United States and what happens in other countries such as France. I think rums in particular could benefit from toasted oak barrels, and I don't know enough about rums to be able to say one way, shape, form, or the other how common a toasted barrel would be with rum. But I would suspect that of the French tradition with rum production, you would probably see toasted barrels pretty regularly. So yeah, there is a very, very long history of using those that predates using the char here. We actually think that the char here may have been adapted from seeing French oak barrels that were toasted for a little bit too long and getting a very light char to them, as it were. So I'm wondering what characteristics of a spirit, maybe what kind of spirits. I kind of answered that. And then what someone could expect from an aged product. So what I'm looking for really with that agave spirit we put in that toasted bad motivator barrel is I'm looking for all those elements of that agave spirit or that agave syrup to come through. Now the agave spirit is syrup. Sorry, I keep doing that. Is not overly complex of its own accord. It's kind of sweet. It's kind of like clover honey. And I want to hold on to that, especially aromatically. More so though, what I'm after is to hold on to the smoke that was in the rye malt that we put into that particular spirit, right? Not have that barrel overdrive that smoke and not lose that. What I'm looking for is a blend and balance of that spirit as it was and the oak and the contribution of the oak to where you get both of those coming together 50-50, right? That oak is going to add structure. It's going to add backbone, but it's not going to overrun the beauty of the raw spirit itself. Let's see. Let me go back to your email here and see what else I might have missed in here. I think I got most of them. So as far as char, like I said, with bourbons, rye whiskeys, etc., you're going to want to use those. We do some amount of oat whiskey at work that we actually put into toasted barrels. And I like to use toasted barrels as well for finishing, even with bourbons. You know, you take a bourbon through a 4-year cycle, pull it out and throw it into a toasted barrel for 6 months to a year, and you'd be surprised how much sweeter and more elegant that spirit would become. Very lightly toasted barrels, I might even use for something like absinthe, and I think that I do have plans to use a bad motivator barrel for a true absinthe that is rested in wood for some amount of time in the near future. So I hope that kind of covered the bases there as far as what you were asking and what you were looking for. But definitely don't feel like you have to have a charred barrel to get an effect from the oak itself. Again, most of the flavor from the oak is going to come from that toasting and the setting of those sugars. And understand this, that even underneath the char level in a bourbon barrel, there's a layer of toast. And that layer of toast, again, is where most of the flavor in that spirit, as far as the barrel comes from, is from that toasted layer. And again, the char is just there's a filtration device for distillations that might be big or aggressive, or distillates that might be of their own accord, big or aggressive in their own raw way. So as always, guys, if you have questions, bishopshomegrown@gmail.com, thealchemistcabinet.com, social media, or the YouTube comments below. Love y'all. Have a great one.